It wasn't meant to surface now, not ever. Hidden deep within a sealed archive tied to Prince Philip's final directives, a document has reportedly emerged that changes everything. And at its center, Queen Camilla quietly, but decisively, cut out. What began as a legal whisper is now erupting into a full-blown royal reckoning. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it was dismissed as nothing more than another passing rumor, one of countless murmurs that drift through palace corridors and vanish without consequence. But this time, the silence that followed felt different, heavier, more deliberate. Reports began to surface suggesting that a sealed directive, long believed to be buried alongside Prince Philip's final legal affairs, had quietly been accessed. Not publicly disclosed, not formally acknowledged, just uncovered. And those who had seen it, even briefly, weren't speaking loudly. But they were speaking enough to unsettle the very foundation of royal certainty. Because according to multiple legal insiders, this wasn't a routine estate document. It allegedly contained precise, calculated clauses that appeared to limit influence, access, and perhaps even entitlement. Not broadly, not vaguely, but with a focus that insiders whisper pointed unmistakably in one direction. The timing alone has raised more questions than answers. Why now? Why would a document tied to Prince Philip's legacy emerge years after his passing, at a moment when the monarchy is already navigating fragile transitions and shifting public trust? Some suggest it's coincidence. Others insist it's anything but. Because within palace circles, the reaction was immediate and telling. There was no public statement, no outright denial. Instead, there was what insiders describe as controlled panic, a tightening of communication channels, a noticeable shift in tone among senior aides. Behind closed doors, conversations that grew sharper, quieter, and far more urgent. What makes this even more unsettling is the growing belief that this directive wasn't an afterthought, it was intentional. Carefully structured, strategically placed. There are early murmurs that Queen Camilla's position within certain aspects of the royal framework had been quietly, deliberately limited long before the public narrative ever suggested stability, not removed, not challenged openly, but contained. And if true, it points to something far more complex than a simple estate decision. It hints at long-standing internal tensions that were never fully resolved, only managed, carefully and silently, until now. Because documents like these don't just appear. They are written with purpose, preserved with precision, and revealed only when the weight of keeping them hidden becomes heavier than the consequences of exposure. Which raises the question no one inside the palace seems willing to answer directly: who knew about this, and how long have they been protecting it from the world? The answers remain just out of reach, but the implications are already rippling through every corner of the royal institution, tightening the pressure with each passing moment, pulling the story deeper into something far more consequential than anyone initially imagined. But to understand why such an order would exist, one must revisit the legacy Prince Philip spent a lifetime protecting. For decades, Prince Philip stood as the monarchy's silent enforcer, unyielding, strategic, and fiercely protective of its sacred framework. Those who knew him understood one thing: legacy was never negotiable. So when whispers emerged that his final orders targeted a sitting queen consort, it raises a chilling question: what did he see coming that others ignored? To understand the weight behind those whispers, it's impossible to separate the man from the system he spent a lifetime defending. Prince Philip was never just a consort standing beside the throne. He was, in many ways, the unseen architect of its endurance during its most fragile decades. While public attention often centered on ceremony and symbolism, insiders long suggested that Philip operated within a different sphere entirely, one defined not by appearances, but by structure, discipline, and long-term control. His role, as described by those familiar with palace operations, was rooted in continuity, the preservation of a system that, in his view, could not afford weakness, improvisation, or emotional compromise. Reports have often hinted that his influence extended far beyond public duties, reaching deep into the legal and financial mechanisms that underpin the monarchy itself. Estate structuring, asset distribution, long-term trust arrangements, these were not abstract concerns to him. They were instruments of stability. tools to ensure that what had been built over centuries could not be quietly reshaped by shifting loyalties or personal ambitions. And within that framework, inheritance was never simply about wealth. It was about control, about who holds influence, who shapes decisions, and ultimately, who safeguards the institution when its public image begins to waver. This is where the tension begins to take form. Because throughout royal history, there has always been an unspoken line between those born into the system and those who enter it from the outside. Not a rule written in law, but one deeply embedded in tradition, expectation, and trust. Various interpretations from royal commentators have long suggested that Prince Philip viewed this distinction with particular seriousness, not out of personal bias, but out of a belief that the monarchy's survival depended on clarity, on knowing where loyalty begins and where it might, under pressure, shift. And in moments of uncertainty, that line becomes sharper, more significant, and far less forgiving. Insiders whisper that this perspective shaped many of his later decisions, especially as the monarchy entered a period of increasing scrutiny and internal complexity. Relationships evolved, roles shifted, public narratives changed. But beneath all of that, Philip's approach reportedly remained the same: measured, calculated, and unwavering. If there were vulnerabilities, they were to be addressed quietly. If there were risks, they were to be contained before they could surface. And if there were individuals whose positions introduced uncertainty into the balance of power, then safeguards, subtle but effective, would be put in place. That is why the current revelations feel less like a sudden rupture and more like the uncovering of something long prepared. Because the foundations of these alleged estate clauses did not appear overnight. They were built over years, layered into documents, reinforced through legal structures, and protected by the very silence that now surrounds them. And as those layers begin to peel back, the intention behind, they becomes harder to ignore, not reactionary, not emotional, but deliberate. And within those carefully constructed protections, one name appears to have been deliberately sidelined. Buried within pages of legal language, one clause reportedly stands apart: cold, deliberate, and unmistakable in its intent. It doesn't name names outright, but insiders insist its target is clear: Queen Camilla. A quiet exclusion, written not in anger but in strategy. What makes this clause so unsettling is not its tone, but its precision. Those who claim to have reviewed fragments of the directive describe wording that is deliberately indirect, carefully constructed to avoid confrontation while achieving a very specific outcome. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't challenge. Instead, it limits subtly, but effectively. Legal analysts, speaking cautiously, suggest that this kind of language is often used when the goal is not to provoke resistance, but to quietly define boundaries that cannot easily be undone. And in this case, those boundaries appear to revolve around access: who can influence certain decisions, who can engage with particular assets, and perhaps most significantly, who cannot. The effect, according to various interpretations, is not immediate exclusion from everything, but something far more controlled: a narrowing of pathways, a restriction of reach, the kind of legal containment that operates in the background, invisible to public view, yet powerful enough to shape outcomes over time. If true, it would mean that influence itself, arguably the most valuable currency within the monarchy, was being carefully redirected. Not stripped away in a dramatic gesture, but quietly rerouted through mechanisms that only a handful of insiders would fully understand. And that is where the weight of this clause begins to settle. Because in a system where perception is everything, control behind the scenes is what ultimately defines reality. Reports from those familiar with royal legal frameworks suggest that the clause carries what they describe as unusual specificity, not in the sense of naming individuals directly, but in how narrowly it defines its scope. It doesn't cast a wide net. It targets conditions, circumstances, and positions in a way that, when applied, leaves little ambiguity about who it affects. That level of detail, insiders whisper, is rarely accidental. It points to intention, to foresight, to a deliberate effort to anticipate future scenarios and address them before they could fully emerge. And if that is the case, then the clause is not simply reactive, it is preemptive. A safeguard placed not for the present moment, but for a future that Prince Philip may have already begun to anticipate. Even more striking is the reported timing of its insertion. Legal sources suggest that this provision was not part of the earliest drafts, but rather introduced at a later stage, refined, adjusted, and ultimately embedded into the final structure of directive. That detail alone has sparked intense speculation. Why add such a clause late in the process? What changed? What new developments, relationships, or concerns prompted its inclusion at that particular moment? Because late-stage additions are rarely casual, they are responses. Responses to evolving realities, to shifting dynamics, to concerns that could no longer be ignored. And in this case, the response appears to have been both measured and decisive. Within royal legal circles, the initial reaction to these revelations has reportedly been one of quiet unease. Not open disagreement, not public alarm, but a recognition that something significant has surfaced. Advisors, bound by discretion, are said to be revisiting documents, reassessing interpretations, and carefully considering the implications of what this clause could mean if fully acknowledged. Because once a document like this is brought into the light, even partially, it cannot simply be dismissed. It must be understood. And perhaps more importantly, it must be managed. But the real shock wasn't the clause itself, it was how long it had been kept hidden. The silence wasn't accidental, it was enforced. According to palace insiders, knowledge of Prince Philip's final directive circulated quietly among senior aides, and yet no public acknowledgement was ever made. Why? Because revealing it sooner could have triggered a constitutional storm. What began as a tightly guarded secret soon revealed itself to be something far more calculated, a silence not born from oversight, but from strategy. Those familiar with internal palace operations suggest that the directive was never entirely unknown. It existed in fragments of conversation, in carefully worded briefings, in the subtle shifts of protocol that only seasoned insiders would recognize. Senior officials, legal advisors, and select members of the royal household were, by various accounts, aware that something significant had been embedded within Prince Philip's final arrangements. But awareness did not lead to disclosure. Instead, it led to containment. Because within an Arabic Aleph, Arabic Lam, Arabic Meme, Arabic Hamza Lawaw, Arabic Sin, Arabic Temur Buddha, as fragile and symbolically powerful as the monarchy, information is never neutral, it is controlled, shaped, and released only when its impact can be managed. And this particular piece of information carried risks that extended far beyond legal interpretation. If the directive truly implied limitations surrounding Queen Camilla, then its early exposure could have ignited a wave of speculation powerful enough to destabilize carefully constructed public narratives. Narratives that had taken years to solidify. Narratives that positioned unity where there may have been quiet division. And so, the decision was made not publicly, not formally, but through a shared understanding among those at the top to keep it buried. Reports suggest that aides were not simply discouraged from discussing the directive, they were instructed, firmly and clearly, to avoid it. Altogether, conversations were redirected. Questions were deflected. Even within internal circles, references to the document were said to be minimal, often reduced to vague acknowledgments that something existed without ever confronting what it truly meant. This kind of controlled silence is not unusual within royal operations, but the intensity surrounding this particular directive stood out. It hinted at a deeper concern that even acknowledging its existence could unravel a narrative the monarchy could not afford to lose control of. At the heart of that concern was perception. Because Queen Camilla's position within the royal family has always been shaped as much by public acceptance as by institutional legitimacy. Over time, that acceptance had been carefully built, reinforced through appearances, messaging, and a steady integration into the monarchy's core image. But a revelation like this, suggesting that Prince Philip himself had placed quiet limitations on her role, could shift that perception in ways that no amount of public relations could easily contain. It would raise questions not just about her standing, but about the internal dynamics of the royal family as a whole. Questions about trust, about authority, about who truly holds influence behind closed doors. And yet, silence has a cost. Because the longer something is hidden, the greater the pressure becomes when it inevitably surfaces. Insiders suggest that over time, that pressure began to build through legal reviews, through shifting alliances, through the simple reality that documents of this magnitude cannot remain concealed indefinitely. The monarchy's reliance on controlled narratives began to strain under the weight of what was being withheld, and eventually, as is often the case, the system designed to protect the secret became the very thing that allowed it to slip through. Not in a single dramatic moment, but through a gradual unraveling, whispers becoming conversations, conversations becoming confirmations. And when the truth finally surfaced, the reaction inside royal circles was immediate and deeply personal. For Queen Camilla, the revelation wasn't just political, it was personal. A lifetime of navigating scrutiny, rebranding, and eventual acceptance now faces its most destabilizing test yet, because this wasn't public criticism. This was exclusion from within. For years, her journey into the heart of the monarchy had been defined by persistence. Not sudden triumph, not effortless acceptance, but a slow, deliberate transformation shaped by time, restraint, and careful positioning. She had endured public doubt, shifting narratives, and the weight of history itself, gradually moving from the margins into a role that, at least on the surface, appeared secure. And yet, this revelation threatens to undo that sense of stability in a way that no external criticism ever could. Because it doesn't come from the outside world. It comes from within the very institution she worked to become part of, and that distinction changes everything. The emotional weight of such a directive, if the reports hold even partial truth, is difficult to overstate. It suggests that even at the highest levels, even after years of public alignment and internal integration, there were boundaries that remained firmly in place. Not visible, not openly acknowledged, but written nonetheless. And that creates a quiet but powerful tension between image and reality. Because while the public narrative may have signaled unity, progression, and acceptance, the existence of such a clause implies a different story unfolding behind closed doors, one where trust was measured, influence was calculated, and roles were defined with far greater caution than anyone outside the palace was led to believe. This is where perception begins to fracture. Because legitimacy within the monarchy is not solely granted by title, it is reinforced by acceptance, both internally and externally. And now, that acceptance is being questioned in a way that feels deeply personal. If Prince Philip, a figure synonymous with institutional discipline and long-term vision, saw reason to impose limitations, then it raises uncomfortable questions. Not just about Camilla's role, but about how fully that role was ever embraced within the deeper structures of royal power. And once those questions take hold, they are not easily dismissed. They linger. They grow. They reshape how every gesture, every decision, every appearance is interpreted moving forward. Inside palace walls, reports suggest that old divisions long managed, carefully balanced, are beginning to resurface. Not openly, not dramatically, but in subtle shifts of alignment, in the tone of internal discussions, in the way certain decisions are approached with renewed caution. Because a revelation like this doesn't just affect one individual, it reopens conversations that were never fully resolved. Conversations about influence, about hierarchy, about the invisible lines that define who holds real authority and who operates within its boundaries. And as those lines are revisited, the atmosphere becomes heavier, more uncertain, more fragile than it has been in years. At the same time, the contrast between public and private narratives has never felt more pronounced. To the outside world, the image remains composed, steady, controlled. But beneath that surface, the implications of this directive continue to ripple outward, challenging assumptions that once felt secure. It creates a quiet but persistent question: has her influence been gradually diminishing? Not suddenly, but by design. Not through confrontation, but through carefully structured limitations that have only now come into focus. And if that is the case, then what we are witnessing is not a sudden shift, but the unveiling of a process that has been unfolding in silence for far longer than anyone realized. And as that realization begins to settle, it becomes clear that this is no longer just about personal impact or individual standing. Because when influence is questioned at this level, the consequences extend far beyond one role or one relationship. They begin to reshape the balance itself, the delicate, often unseen structure that holds the monarchy together, guiding its decisions, defining its future, and determining who ultimately carries the weight of its legacy forward. Yet beyond personal implications, the directive has triggered something far more consequential: a shift in royal power dynamics. As the dust begins to settle, figures like Prince William and Princess Anne are said to be watching closely. Because if Philip's directive holds legal weight, it doesn't just affect Camilla, it reshapes the balance of power within the monarchy itself. What follows is not chaos, but calculation. Within the upper ranks of the royal structure, moments like this are rarely met with public reaction, they are met with quiet reassessment. Insiders suggest that senior royals have begun to reevaluate the internal hierarchy, not in dramatic gestures, but through subtle recalibrations. Who attends which meetings? Who is consulted on key decisions? Who holds influence over the narratives that define the monarchy's future? These shifts are rarely announced, but they are deeply felt, especially in a system where proximity to power often matters more than titles themselves. And now, with the shadow of Prince Philip's directive looming over everything, those calculations have taken on a new urgency. There are whispers that long-standing protocols, guidelines that have existed for decades but are rarely invoked, are being quietly revisited. Not as a direct response, but as a precaution. Because if the directive is confirmed to carry enforceable weight, it may activate mechanisms designed precisely for moments like this. Mechanisms that prioritize continuity over personal alignment, that reinforce structure over sentiment, and that ensure the monarchy remains anchored, even when internal tensions begin to surface. These protocols, often invisible to the public, represent the backbone of royal governance, and their potential activation signals that what is unfolding is being taken far more seriously than anyone outside the institution might realize. At the center of this recalibration is a growing sense of consolidation. Not aggressive, not confrontational, but deliberate. Core members of the royal family, those whose roles are deeply tied to the monarchy's long-term stability, are said to be aligning more closely, sharing information, strengthening communication, reinforcing a unified approach that places legacy above individual influence. This is not about exclusion in the traditional sense, it is about reinforcement. About ensuring that decision-making authority remains concentrated within a framework that has been tested, refined, and protected over generations. And in moments of uncertainty, that framework becomes the monarchy's most reliable defense. Legal teams, operating with characteristic discretion, are reportedly examining every angle of the directive's enforceability, not rushing to conclusions, but carefully analyzing language, context, and precedent, because the implications of confirming such a clause extend far beyond one individual. They touch the very mechanisms through which royal authority is defined and exercised. If upheld, it would not simply validate Prince Philip's foresight. It would set a precedent, one that could influence how future directives are interpreted and implemented. And that possibility alone has added a new layer of gravity to an already complex situation. What is perhaps most striking, however, is how these developments are reshaping decision-making itself. Not through overt changes, but through a gradual shift in who holds the final say. Insiders suggest that authority, once broadly distributed, is becoming more focused, guided by those seen as custodians of tradition rather than participants in evolving narratives. It is a subtle transformation, almost imperceptible from the outside, yet profoundly significant within. Because in the monarchy, power is rarely seized. It is absorbed, redirected, reinforced through quiet consensus rather than open declaration. And as this process unfolds, the atmosphere grows increasingly charged not with conflict, but with anticipation. Because every adjustment, every recalibration, points towards something larger taking shape. A new equilibrium. One that reflects not just the present moment, but the long-term vision embedded within the monarchy's deepest structures. And yet, for all the strategy and control, one uncertainty remains impossible to ignore: how far will these changes go, and who will ultimately define their outcome? And as these forces realign, one question looms over everything: what happens next? Moments like this don't just test individuals, they test institutions. And for the House of Windsor, the emergence of this directive forces a confrontation with its own principles, loyalty, legacy, and the limits of personal power within a system built on tradition. What now hangs in the balance is not a single relationship, not a single decision, but the fragile architecture that has allowed the monarchy to endure through decades of turbulence. Because institutions like this are not sustained by ceremony alone, they are sustained by belief. Belief in continuity, belief in unity, belief that behind the scenes, The structure is as stable as the image presented to the world. And when something surfaces that suggests otherwise, even subtly, it introduces a fracture not necessarily visible, but deeply felt. The question is no longer whether the monarchy can withstand scrutiny. It has done so before. The question is whether it can withstand this particular kind of scrutiny, one that originates from within its own carefully guarded foundations. Public trust, once steady, now finds itself navigating uncertainty. Not because of loud scandal or dramatic upheaval, but because of something quieter, more complex. The idea that decisions of such significance could exist beyond public awareness, shaping outcomes without acknowledgement, creates a tension between transparency and tradition. The monarchy has always operated within that tension, balancing what must be seen with what must remain unseen. But as global audiences become more aware, more analytical, and more demanding of clarity, that balance becomes harder to maintain. Every withheld detail begins to carry weight. Every silence invites interpretation. And slowly the narrative shifts not through declaration, but through perception. At the heart of this moment lies the enduring power of legacy documents, those silent frameworks that outlast individuals and shape the course of the institution long after their creators are gone. These are not ordinary legal instruments. They are expressions of intent, carefully designed to guide the monarchy through moments that cannot yet be fully predicted. And yet, when one of these documents emerges into public awareness, it transforms from a quiet safeguard into a focal point of debate. Its meaning is no longer controlled solely by those who wrote it. It becomes subject to interpretation, to analysis, to scrutiny from voices both inside and outside the institution. And that shift changes everything. Because once a legacy document is questioned, the very idea of unseen governance begins to feel less secure. This is where the tension between personal loyalty and institutional duty becomes impossible to ignore. The monarchy is built on relationships on trust formed over years, sometimes decades. But it is also built on rules that transcend those relationships. Rules that demand difficult choices when personal alignment conflicts with long-term stability. And in moments like this, those choices are brought into sharp focus. Because if the directive reflects a decision to prioritize structure over sentiment, then it reveals a truth that has always existed but rarely been spoken aloud, that within the monarchy, duty does not bend easily, even for those at its center. As the story continues to unfold, the role of global attention intensifies. Media platforms, analysts, and audiences across the world are now engaging with a narrative that once would have remained confined to private discussions. Each interpretation adds pressure. Each headline amplifies uncertainty. And with that amplification comes a new challenge for the monarchy, not simply to maintain control, but to maintain coherence. Because in an environment where every detail is examined, the ability to adapt becomes just as important as the ability to endure. And adaptation, within an institution defined by tradition, is never straightforward. It requires careful movement, measured responses, and an understanding that every shift, no matter how small, carries long-term consequences. And so, the monarchy stands at a quiet crossroads, not marked by dramatic announcements or visible upheaval, but by a gradual redefinition of how it navigates moments like this. Can it preserve its core identity while responding to evolving expectations? Can it maintain the strength of its traditions while acknowledging the realities of a changing world? These are not questions with immediate answers. They unfold slowly, shaped by decisions made in silence, by strategies that may only become clear with time. But what is certain is that this moment will leave a mark, subtle, perhaps, but lasting. A reminder that even the most enduring institutions are not immune to the weight of their own history. Because in the end, this isn't just about one directive, it's about what the monarchy chooses to become. In the quiet aftermath, one truth remains impossible to ignore. Prince Philip may no longer be here, but his influence still shapes the monarchy's future. And if his final order stands, then this moment marks not just a revelation but a reckoning. What began as a whisper has now settled into something far heavier, far more enduring. Because the true impact of this directive is not confined to the present moment, it stretches forward, quietly shaping what comes next. Long-term consequences are rarely immediate within institutions like this. They unfold gradually, through shifts in behavior, in decision-making, in the subtle recalibration of authority. And already, there are signs that this process has begun. The way influence is exercised, the way roles are defined, the way trust is measured, all of it now exists under a new lens, one that cannot be easily dismissed or forgotten. Because once a boundary is revealed, even indirectly, it begins to redefine everything around it. The question of enforcement now lingers at the center of the unfolding narrative. Not enforcement in the dramatic sense, not through public declarations or visible actions, but through something quieter, symbolic: reinforcement. Legal frameworks, if they hold, do not need to be loudly invoked to be effective. They operate through recognition, through adherence, through the understanding that certain lines, once drawn, are not meant to be crossed. And if this directive carries that kind of weight, then its power lies not in confrontation, but in its silent authority. It shapes outcomes without needing to announce itself. It guides decisions without demanding attention. And in doing so, it becomes part of the monarchy's invisible architecture, present, constant, and deeply influential. For Queen Camilla, the path ahead now feels more uncertain than it has in years. Not because her role has been publicly challenged, but because its foundations have been quietly questioned. The distinction matters. Public criticism can be addressed, managed, reframed. But internal limitations, especially those tied to legacy, are far more difficult to navigate. They do not disappear with time. They remain, shaping perception from within, influencing how every action is interpreted moving forward. And so, her future within the royal structure may not be defined by sudden change, but by a gradual narrowing of influence, a subtle repositioning that reflects the boundaries now brought into focus. At the same time, this moment reinforces something far larger than any single individual. It reasserts the enduring presence of Prince Philip's legacy. Not as memory, not as symbolism, but as a living force embedded within the monarchy's framework. His role as protector was never about visibility. It was about foresight, about anticipating risks before they emerged, and placing safeguards that would endure long after he was gone. And if this directive is indeed one of those safeguards, then it stands as a testament to that vision, calculated, deliberate, and unyielding in its purpose. It reminds those within the institution that legacy is not simply inherited. It is enforced, often in ways that only become clear with time. This is where the monarchy now faces its defining tension between returning to the rigidity of tradition and continuing its gradual evolution. For years, it has walked a careful line, adapting just enough to remain relevant while holding firmly to its core principles. But moments like this test that balance. They force a choice, even if that choice is never openly declared. Does the institution lean into the structures that have preserved it for centuries, reinforcing boundaries and reaffirming control? Or does it continue to evolve, finding ways to reconcile tradition with the complexities of modern expectation? The answer may not come quickly, but it will shape the monarchy's direction in ways that extend far beyond this single moment. And as everything settles into a new, quieter reality, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: the monarchy does not move on from moments like this. It absorbs them. It reshapes itself around them. It carries them forward, embedding their lessons into its future decisions, its internal dynamics, its very identity. What appears to be an ending is often something else entirely: a transition, subtle but profound, into a new phase of understanding. One where the past is not left behind, but actively shaping what lies ahead. Because in the House of Windsor, legacy is never buried, it waits, quietly, until the moment it must be enforced. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.